Good evening, everyone. Tonight we have invited a very special guest to speak, Dr. Hani Bawardi. He is from the University of Michigan, Dearborn, and he is here to share his expertise on Palestine and the Arab American identity. As an author and associate professor at the U of M Dearborn, Dr. Bawardi has been a very important figure in understanding the Arab American movement, and we're thrilled to have him here to share that knowledge. Thank you.
I teach, among other things, a service course about Michigan's history. And we only have 1 week or one lecture to talk about the original Michiganians, the First Nations of these lands. And understanding what happens in Palestine almost demands that you understand what happened historically to a whole lot of people, including the original inhabitants of these lands. I took a small walk outside just now. I like rocks in general, and I found myself making more than a few friends. Those boulders sitting in the park there almost was actually trying to find names for them. It becomes easy when you find myself petting them actually. It's easy to understand why the original inhabitants of these lands look at nature, look at themselves as an extension of nature, one element in nature, no different than a boulder or a tree or whatever. And they practice something, as many of you know, called the reciprocity, which is an exchange of tools and favors and expertise, which was very important. And the basis for authority was not hereditary or power or wealth. It was wisdom and love and kindness. All of that changed when they came in contact with the Europeans. That is a segue for our discussion. To be a little bit more specific, although I'll be oscillating between what happened to the Anishinaabe nations, the Ottawa, the Chippewa or Ojibwe, and the Potawatomis. If anyone here is a member of the nation, help me with the pronunciation, please. Potawatomi is correct? I heard it pronounced that way in different ways.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Yeah. Those First Nations lived in perfect harmony with nature until their way of life came to an end because the Europeans brought with them a totally different mode of living. So you will find that there is a lot of similarities between their fate and what's happening in Palestine. You can draw a straight line between them. I mean, if nothing else, the people who have caused and still do all this havoc, destruction and death in the Middle East and the Far East and Africa and all over the world are the same people who ended this way of life for the Aboriginal people here, the original Michiganians, the British and the French, and the Brits who became Americans, finished the job basically. So it's very important to understand your environment so that the conversation, which I hope we will have one, will be expanded, will extrapolate, to step back and look at human experience as a shared one. If you don't care about what happens in your environment, wherever you happen to be in the world, you can hardly care about what happens in Palestine in a meaningful way, because it can happen to you, probably by the same people. Northwestern European cultures that became, or societies that became extremely powerful. With the passage of time, you kind of lose sight of how these things happen. It creeps up on you. So your interest, as you will find, and socialists understand this more than anyone, your well-being, you begin to think, is tied to the welfare of the state and whatever the state does. That's part of the fog that kind of obscures our connection to historical events and what they mean. So, and yes, the students wanted to know about the meaning of Palestine in Arab American life. And there again, by the end of this talk, you'll find that it was all about Palestine from the get-go in Arab American experience. Not because Palestine is special or Palestinians are, they're not. They were subsumed by being Syrians, I'll explain that in a minute, or being an Arab. But it's because that's where the need was the greatest, from the get-go, from the onslaught of colonialism in the Middle East. And in the interim, I also would like very much to explain why wars are waged. What purpose do they serve? Namely, how do the people who exact this much violence on others, what do they benefit? Why this carnage in Gaza? These are basic questions that will help us draw connections to the past and also to our environments. So, a bit of a background, the Arab world. This map is kind of useful to look at. I'm sorry I didn't have my laser pointer. another form of weapon. Look cool for a second at least. So this, you know what this is. This is a map of the Levant here, for the most part, Mediterranean, the Arabian or Persian Gulf. And our area of interest to demarcate the start of, immigration by Arabic-speaking folks to the United States, or emigration to the United States, came from this region. So if you take a natural line, the Taurus Mountains in the north, separating Anatolia from Syria here, to the east there is a desert along the Euphrates, more or less. And the desert in northern Saudi Arabia, and Sinai, more or less. So this area here is natural Syria, geographic Syria, what the Arabs called Bilad al-Sham, when Islam diffused from this region here northward. It's a contiguous cultural geographic unit. People have a lot in common. If they disagreed on anything in the past, it was about how much crushed wheat you put in the tabbouleh, or how much tahini in the hummus. I mean, it was very superficial differences between them. Dialects varied a little bit, but they were part of a contiguous cultural space. And that's also the seat of one of the sparks behind the rise of Arab national and social awakening or consciousness. And all these colors basically demarcate the stretch of the Ottoman Empire at different time periods. As you can see, what really concerns us is that the Ottoman Empire ruled over the Levant, Syria, part of Iraq, eventually all of Iraq, and all the way down to Western Saudi Arabia. But this region here was under Ottoman rule when Arabic-speaking folks began to immigrate. And we say Arabic speakers because there were Armenians and Kurds and non-Arabs among them. Chaldeans who may or may not identify as Arabs, Assyrians, Ashurian, who they leave out. So they were inhabitants of the same region, spoke Arabic every day. Jewish people, were very much part of the fabric of society. Thousands lived, something like 300,000 in Iraq alone. Thousands lived in Damascus, and a couple of 100,000 in the vicinity of Cairo and Egypt, and North Africa had hundreds of thousands, Morocco and Algeria. All that, unfortunately, so we're impoverished by the departure of those people. We can talk about that later if you like. So the Ottoman Empire then kind of sat in the Middle East. At the same time, it spared that region the onslaught of colonialism. At least it delayed it until after World War I. By World War I, I mean the British were wreaking havoc in China, India, as you know, and Africa, Portuguese, and the Dutch, and those folks were after gold. The minute Vasco da Gama found a passage around the Horn of Africa, that was the start of the end of the Ottoman Empire. You can bypass it and do trade with India and China. What people were after was spice, as most of you know. And that race to find spice and silk was what sent the Spanish and the French, and behind them the British, to find the passageway to India. That's why the folks of these lands became Indians. The red man, Indian Americans. So in the interim, they found all kinds of cash crops, and that is worth a conversation. The Americans' experience in the Middle East was initially benign. They wanted to translate the Bible into Arabic and proselytize and convert Muslims. That was a silly goal, of course, because Muslims don't convert. And they also believe in God, believe in Christ, believe in the virgin birth, and they're an extension of the Old and New Testaments. They're monotheists already. So they themselves became really good Arabists. They basically became advocates of the region later on. Maybe we'll have a chance to talk about that. That's Cornelius van Dyck, and then he died before the mission was accomplished in terms of translating the Bible. So Eli Smith finished the job. And those two gentlemen here, Ibrahim Yazigi and Butrus al-Bustani, those were the brains behind an articulation of national, cultural, new consciousness for Arabs during Ottoman times, but they were looking forward to a time when Ottoman sovereignty will dissipate and they will gain their independence. They were thinking in terms of independence that early on. In Western discourse, I'm at odds with almost everything that's been written, that those guys did not constitute a people, that they only thought of themselves as such after Westerners came and introduced institutions and introduced the press. Sure enough, the Americans brought with them a linotype, and the American, actually to this day, a type set is called the American type to this day. But they did not introduce knowledge per se. They learned from the region more than they introduced knowledge. The ones who really captured that East-West connectedness or the cultural contacts were folks who went to the Sorbonne and to Cambridge and were educated in the West, brought with them knowledge about agriculture initially to improve their lives. So cultural contacts was the name of the game. In Western discourse, that is kind of dismissed in favor of a clash of civilization. Samuel Huntington and then Bernard Lewis, and that's the charmer who gave us Condoleezza Rice and Tennant and Dick Cheney, the architects of the destruction of Iraq, because they see the world as a cultures bound to clash with a zero-sum game. One will remain standing. That's how they think of the world. This is one of the oldest tapestries I got a hold of. I had to return it to the original owners. This is actually was given to one of those earliest immigrants who came, not the earliest, one of the early immigrants who came to participate in the Fourth Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia in 1876. They brought their wares like mother of pearl and nativity scenes carved out of wood, olive wood, and things like that. Looked around and found out there's a huge country with large potential, money to be made. Went back, spread the word, and energetic Syrians hopped on a boat and came to the New World almost the same day very often when they heard the news that there's money to be made. The beginnings were not easy, but what facilitated that is advancement in the steam engine, and ships sailing across the oceans can carry huge loads. You can do that by the end of the 19th century, by the 1870s already. There's a lot of stories about their adventures. One guy actually, it is worth mentioning, who hopped on a ship, bribed the captain to dodge the Ottoman police. And the captain lied to him and dropped him off in Sydney, Australia, and told him, "That's New York, there you go." And the guy spent 2 years there thinking he's in New York. You can almost write a monologue about this. Oh, I love New York. Why have you been there? The Arabic-speaking folks, specifically the Syrians who came to the East Coast initially, New York, Syracuse, diffused, made their way across the entire country because they were accomplished peddlers. They would carry like 200 pounds of trinkets on their backs, and they would walk village to village across the United States. You can find them everywhere. I think one of them is mentioned in Oklahoma, the movie. Ali, the guy, the traveling salesman. What I found in my research, I translated the book published in 1913, is that they learned that from Jewish immigrants. So Lower West Side of Manhattan, Jewish immigrants were on the east side, the Arabs were on the west side, and they learned from them. And that was actually disclosed by an archpriest, Basilius Kharbawi is his name. He published a book about the history of the United States and the history of Syrian immigration to the US. Needs to be translated sooner than later. In 1913, has a lot of really useful information there. And they established press, and they talked about all kinds of things, and they wanted to transplant the precepts of American US democracy in their homelands. They were reformists. They didn't like living under Ottoman rule. They wanted complete independence, and wrote in those terms. And those editors were our best and brightest at the time. And here I found myself challenging a lot of things that were like canons in Arab American studies, based on impressions, not research. One of them, that most of those immigrants were illiterate and poor and hapless. Yes, some were illiterate. The ones who came from the Bekaa and the Beirut area, mostly Maronites. Maronism is an offshoot of Catholicism, were poor and on average illiterate, not all of them. Boutros al-Bustani was a Maronite. Ibrahim al-Yazidi, the one who was at the center of this, Syrian Renaissance or Arab Renaissance, was an Orthodox Christian. Most of those editors happened to be Orthodox, not that it made a huge difference. At the time, it did, and you'll find in the discourse that there was a lot of squabbles and sectarianism. The reason for that is Al-Huda's editor, Naum Mukarzel, was an agent for the French, and he was opposed to any nationalist thinking. And he kept lobbing, insults at all his detractors. So he created an impression that there is a lot of discord and squabbles and sectarianism. It was intra-Christian. He was a Maronite, the rest were Orthodox, he didn't like them, and the French gave him a lot of money to do this. He did this on purpose, systematically almost. Jurab al-Kurdi is the name of a paper edited by Anton Zurey, just to give you an idea about how serious things were. The guy went to visit family in Syria. The Turks captured him because he opposed their rule, tortured him and killed him and his brother in northern Syria. So it was very serious. And here are those editors again. In 1913, something really important happened. Everyone knew World War I was a matter of time. It came as no surprise, by the way. Yes, there was a spark for it, the murder of Count Bernadotte, Ferdinand, by Arabel, and that sparked World War I. But everyone expected it. Habsburg dynasty straddled Asia and Europe, and it was unsettled, squabbles, and the French and the British were hard at work since the early 19th century to put their hands on Syria, on Palestine, and on that region, because maritime travel was still the easiest way to travel. If you're at the shore of the Mediterranean, remember the map, it was the shortest distance to the Persian Gulf, and off you go to China and India and elsewhere. And they were in competition with each other. So whoever put their hand on that area, it's like the gateway to Asia from Europe. So you have Europe, you have Asia, begins at Anatolia, with the Bosphorus, and you have Africa to southwest. And Palestine is right in the middle. That's a curse and a blessing, although more curse than not. And those folks went to the first Arab conference in Paris to articulate what Arabs want. Complete independence, in stages. And that's what also escapes Western historians and political scientists. I found myself as one of those examples where I kind of had to challenge the discourse because they all argue that they did not have any national aspirations. In fact, I found ample evidence that they did. The immigrants played a central role. This is Najib Riyad, this fellow over here. See the cursor? Oh, you can. Okay, no more Star Wars, I guess. No more sticks. Oh, this is tricky. All right, this guy. Najib Riyad, editor of Hayat al-Arab, was actually an accomplished author and articulated position to Ottoman rule. And he went as an emissary of the United Syrian Society, the largest organization the immigrants had, non-sectarian, non-political at the time, although it had decidedly Syrian nationalist leanings, sent him. And those other gentlemen are also very, very well-known Arab nationalists. There was Hani Zahrawi, he was killed by the Ottomans also. So was Abdul Ghani al-Awaisi and many, many others who were attending that conference. I found the proceedings of the entire conference, word for word, in this book at a library in Al-Najah University in Nablus. Copied the whole thing, brought it with me, and the Israelis took, it was lost during the search on my way out, and I lost it. So the students there photocopied, this is before we had easier way of transporting things electronically. They photocopied every single page in the book and sent them like 4 or 5 at a time in emails. So I reassembled it and I leaned on that for my research. Very, very useful book. That leaves no doubt that those guys, Zahrawi especially, were sophisticated and they had a plan. There were secret societies at the time who wanted this independence in stages. They said, if we ask for independence, the French and the British will assume we're their allies. They will pounce on the Ottoman Empire, which was weakening in a very, very poor state. And we will fall prey to their colonial designs. That's exactly what happened. They said, no, we want the Ottoman Empire to remain as an umbrella, but we will get our independence in stages. First autonomy, and then complete independence. That's a really important piece of information because that information is the basis of the first Arab American political organization in Flint, Michigan, as you will see in a minute. So, during World War I, the Allies wanted the Arabs to fight on their behalf against the Ottomans and the Germans. There was something called Hussein McMahon Correspondence. McMahon is the British Foreign Secretary. Hussein is the Sharif of Mecca that oversees the holy places in Mecca, Western Saudi Arabia. The Wahhabis were in the east. The Sauds were not rulers yet. The British will make sure they are later on. We'll have to leave this aside for now. Hussein received correspondence from McMahon that we promise we'll give you Syria as your country, and it will be ruled by your son Faisal if you fight for us against the Ottomans. In so many words, it was not explicitly. They promised to give them Syria as a free, independent country, which is what they want, ruled by the Ottomans so far. In secret, the year after that, that was in 1915, the correspondence. And then 1916, they kind of employed two charlatans, basically, who unofficially divided the place between Britain and France. So direct control over Palestine for the British and Iraq, and two buffer zones to stay off each other's throats in the middle. So Syria and Lebanon and northern Iraq went to the French, and southern Iraq, Jordan, Palestine went to the British. And they made a deal, they made a swap. The British gave the French $20 million and some royalties for the oil in the north in Kirkuk, and that became part of Iraq. And that more or less what you see here, if you put a line right here, you have the map of Jordan more or less. Yeah. Palestine was left in limbo. So during this time, just to give you an idea about what's happening, as part of the context, can't go back, so I'll stay here. Everyone gathered in Paris at Versailles for the peace talks to tie the loose ends of World War I. Everyone went there, made their case for a country of their own, including King Faisal, and Zionists went there, Frankfurter and others, I think. And one story goes that, Faisal said, sure, you can have Palestine, which is nonsense. Arabs have been accustomed to Jews living among them anyway. They did not understand Zionism as a political aim, as a political program yet. And Muslims give sanction to Christians and Jews. This is more than just, sexy talk. They did enhance Christianity and Judaism, if you ask me. So they were not opposed to Jews as Jews. It doesn't hold water. In any case, in the conference itself, Woodrow Wilson wanted to know what's going on to kind of chart U.S. foreign policy. He sent a fact-finding mission, King and Crane, graduates of the American University of Beirut. I should have mentioned that AUB was actually originally the Syrian Protestant college founded by the Americans, those guys who wanted to translate the Bible. And became a very fine, still is, one of the finest learning institutions in the Middle East. Became AUB, American University of Beirut, in 1920, by the way. So those guys were there, they knew the region, they spoke Arabic, and that they spoke Arabic means they really spoke Arabic like natives. Now, speaking Arabic is like a very nebulous thing. Everyone claims that in their resumes. That's another topic we can talk about maybe later. In any case, they went there, asked people, who are you, what do you want, what's your aspirations? They found that 91% of the population are Arab Palestinians, did not mind living side by Jews, but they wanted to be independent and part of Syria. When they came back to the States, their report was suppressed from Congress. And Congress, after Versailles, you have San Remo Agreement. The British and the French made their plan law, international law, and the United States came out of its isolation, a very isolationist country. We went to World War I kicking and screaming, by the way, 3 years after it started, only to ratify the San Remo Agreement, which legitimized British and French occupation. And something else happened. In 1917, the Balfour Declaration, I don't know if you're familiar, it's a one-page letter, a paragraph almost, by the British Foreign Secretary to Mr. Balfour, a very wealthy Jewish fellow living in Switzerland, I think at the time, that His Majesty's government looks with favor upon the establishment of a national home for the Jews in Palestine, as long as it doesn't disturb the local people. And so it's a classic example of British chicanery and playing with words. That was the spark behind Jewish immigration in larger and larger numbers to Palestine. That was a green light by the British, a very powerful country, to Jewish communities to just go take the place. Until they regretted their decision. By then, 1947, they could not stop them. They were very, very powerful. The Zionist groups, Zionist gangs, as it were, military gangs. So, I think this is a good time to kind of bring up this business of wars. So, strategic location is one reason powerful countries go to war. Palestine is an example. Resources, raw material, cotton in Egypt, whatever Syria had to offer, it almost didn't matter because no powerful country in Europe was about to give it up. No way. Right now you have massive natural gas deposits across the shores of Gaza and the same in Lebanon. So they're not going anywhere. They will not let anyone else extract that gas and sell it. You can make your own conclusions. You can rope in the Ukraine war. Who blew up the gas lines between Russia and Europe? Who benefits? Israel is about to become a regional power, like an energy-producing country on a global scale because of those gas fields. And they're serious about it. And soon they will be providing about 10% of Europe's natural gas needs. So who benefits? Just an idea. Just to tell you, just to kind of propose how capitalism works, basically. So colonialism then, colonizing a place, is an advanced stage of capitalism. Go back to our Aboriginal or First Nations of these lands. Their problems were compounded when William Pitt in England decided to have a mercantiling policy and a presence in the New World to compete with the French and the Catholics, basically, and the Spanish. So you have a triangular trade, timber from these lands, capital from Europe, whatever other countries had to offer. It was about cash. And proximity to oil was foremost on the Westerners' mind, still is, by the way. That's a cash crop. They own a stock, lock, and barrel. Don't be fooled by those Gulf states. They're just agents for American companies. What the French learned, they learned everything from the people of this land, including how to hunt beaver and what it's used for. Then, wearing a top hat, that long hat that, Brits wouldn't be caught dead without it, like shiftless people, murderers, but if you have a top hat, you're a gentleman. And, they discovered tobacco, Potawatomis used that for sparingly, certain families, for rituals. Europeans got hooked on it for nicotine, became a cash crop. Next thing you know, you have a gentleman in those smoking houses, puffing on tobacco, wearing a top hat. Between the tobacco, the top hat, sugar in the ladies' tea at tea time, and the tea itself from China, millions were killed. Millions were enslaved and killed for those products because Europe had a population explosion, the insatiable appetite for consumption. Lipton, actually, named Lipton tea is named after one guy who basically put his hand on the Lipton production in the Far East. Another charmer named Talbot did the same thing in Iran. And because of that and oil, they basically overthrew duly elected Muhammad Mossadegh in 1952 and replaced him by one of those Qajars. That deal between Talbot and the Qajar, minor figure living in the countryside, was how he monopolized tobacco production in Iran. And that was the spark behind the ulama or the imams gaining power, because they said to the people, quit smoking, we'll teach them a lesson. And they did, they quit smoking. And they became leaders out of necessity. That's how, these are the roots of, the Khomeinis and all that movement. So racism is another topic, motivation. Racism is an integral component in US foreign policy. I don't know if you ever watched South Pacific, the musical. Remember the song, "You've got to be carefully taught before you're 7 in so many words, not the exact words, but you've got to be carefully taught. You've got, before you're 6 or 7 or 8, to hate all the people your relatives hate, to be wary of those whose eyes are oddly made," also in the song. So if they're different, watch out for them. So if you're darker skin, you have enslavement in the United States, one drop of blood, familiar with the concept? If you have any black in your country, in your bloodstream for generations, that's it, you're designated as a black person, to keep a very clear line between the races. And that's how you maintain a status quo where it becomes a relationship of power. That's how Europe looks at the rest of the world. And that's how in the 1930s, as a matter of fact, the Zionists, American Zionists, were telling everyone in debates that We represent the West. We're civilized like the West. We're here to protect the Suez Canal, which connects the Red Sea with the Mediterranean, as you know. It's an investment by mostly British and French lawmakers, designed by Lesseps, the same guy who designed the Panama Canal, by the way. It's a private enterprise owned by lawmakers who killed 100,000 Egyptians to build it, and then lent the Khedive Ismail a lot of money to have this huge party, and he commissioned that opera Aida or something, and then he couldn't pay back, so they told him, okay, well, we'll take your shares in the Suez Canal. That's how they function. And if you ask a Brit what the hell, they'll tell you, hey, it's business. It's business. I made my deal with this Qajar guy in the middle of nowhere. That's colonialism. That's what I mean by an outpost for capitalism. The other component we should mention, and that's how you maintain all of this, which is the method, is imperialism. Imperialism is the intellectual component or the moral justification for what you're doing. We have a civilizational message. We're white, we're better, if you want to be openly racist about this. The lovely white, right? They spoke in those terms. They believed that. And that remains a very powerful current in Israel and in the West. If it's not that, it's conjuring like a source of empowerment from divine intervention and saying this is the promised land. The Puritans thought in those terms. When they first came here, they didn't know how to handle themselves. They learned a lot from the native people, and they saw how they were dressed, adorned by feathers, colorful clothes, living in perfect harmony with nature, no problems. Oh, those are the lost tribes of Israel. Then when they did not conform, Christianize, or let them loot and plunder, they became children of the devil. Like that. So God, divine intervention was used by Netanyahu recently, as you know. The Amalekites are the Palestinians, and the Bible said, kill them all, their children, their wives, and their animals. He said that openly in real time, on TV. All of that, you would have been spared knowledge of all of this had it not been for social media, by the way. So, imperialism. Kill the Indian to save the man, if you remember that phrase. And it was maintained by movies as a work of fiction. John Wayne used to say in his movies, Mr. Cowboy, there are human beings and there are Indians. Killing them is it's almost like another cash crop that the antagonist and the protagonist in movies and Hollywood, they grafted that onto Arabs, and they have an entire genre of demeaning Arabs to maintain the status quo, namely support for Israel, unwavering, static support for the Israelis. And these guys are important to me because this fellow right here is Amin Farah, the owner of all those papers I'm sharing with you. This is the son of a one-time mayor of Nazareth in 1899, I think, Salim Farah. This is the guy who founded the first Arab-American political organization. This guy was actually a Brown graduate who worked with Qasim Pasha al-Husseini in London to respond to British mandate. They were very articulate. It didn't matter to the British, of course, one way or the other. That's Amin Farah again in World War I, enlisted. Those guys were really serious about the United States taking an active role to mitigate the influence of Britain and France. Because for a time, although there is the Spanish Civil War, the Spanish-American War, a nasty war, and before that you have the Mexican-American War, but they were hoping the United States would be a little bit different. And he joined World War I, not to get citizenship, which he could. He was offered that and politely declined. He wrote in his diary. But they were serious about learning how to fight and forming some kind of a Syrian army and go back and fight on Syrian land for its independence. And when he was in Nazareth, he's a Nazarene, He's a distant relative of my mother, actually. And he used a furlough. He served in the Ottoman army, 1909, 1908, 1909. And then used the furlough to run to Alexandria. From there, he came to the States late 1913. While he was in Egypt, in Cairo, he joined the Ottoman Decentralized Administration Party. You can see the name if you read Arabic. اللجنة العليا لحزب الله المركزي للتحرير العثماني, which was one of the anti-Ottoman organizations. This one was not so secret. It kept a very low profile. Others were, and this is his membership documents and the receipt, signed by Rafiq al-Azam. If you study the history of the region, that guy is a seminal figure. He's the head of the decentralized committee. This is I can say this is a really important document all day long today, but this is actually the actual bylaws of the Free Syria Society, the very first political, formal Arab American organization founded in Flint, Michigan. And these bylaws, I was able to discern, were in line or similar to the same document adopted by Al-Arabi Fatat, or the Young Arab Society, one of those secret, really secret societies opposed to Ottoman rule. So secret that we don't know all their members to this day. The closest one who came to that is, this is a book you can put on your list if you wish, by George Antonius, Arab Awakening, a classic book. Among the people who came to this country are people like Gibran, Khalil Gibran. I'm sure you recognize the name. How many of you do? Gibran? Cool. Thank God for Gibran. Because he had like a group of friends. Among them, Ali Abu Madi. I'm sure if you grew up in the Middle East, you know who that is. Nasib Arida and Mikhail Naimi, educated in Russia. These are our Hawthornes and Emersons and Edgar Allan Poes. Those guys are huge. And they wrote, most of their writings happened in New York. I'm actually part of a society. We got like a big grant from the Mellon Foundation to install an artwork to celebrate their accomplishments. Al-Qalam, or the pen. It'll be on the lower west side of Manhattan. Elizabeth Berger Plaza, very small, twice the size of this room, but the installation will have some artwork and what have you. And they issued this magazine called Al-Funun, or the Arts. This issue was 1917, and you can see the Arab flag on it, which became the Palestinian flag. So not emerged in a vacuum, but a lot of Arab countries adopted these colors in different schemes, among them the United Arab Emirates. I don't know why. And this passage is by Amin Rihani, who is one of the founders of this group of authors called Arabic al-Qalamiyya, or the Pen Bond. Yeah? Among them Gibran, of course, and the fellows I mentioned. Very, very potent group, and they're not recognized for their patriotism to Syria, but they were. They were, uncompromisingly so, including Gibran. Remember the sectarianism because of that one editor, Naum Mukarzal, agent of the French? He is the reason why people look at Gibran as Lebanese as opposed to Arab. That will happen later. Such are the complexities in Arab American studies that inform, advocacy for Palestine. In 1920 or 21, a physician called Fuad Shatara and a friend of his called Habib Ibrahim Katiba founded what is called, I don't know if you can read this, the Palestine National League in the middle, in English. And in Arabic, it is called Jam'iyyat al-Nahda al-Wataniyya al-Falastiniya, different name. So when I published my book, some people translated the Arabic name, and they somehow decided these are two different organizations. Anyway, so this was a more sophisticated, more focused, more professional, if you will, organization, also political, to defend Palestine. And the spark for it was the Balfour Declaration. Nothing but. They didn't know about Sykes-Picot. until the Bolshevik Revolution published it in 1917, because Russians were in on the Sykes-Picot Agreement. But when the Balfour Declaration came out, they found out, and they said, oh, okay, we're in trouble. And they began to organize. The letter says that they sent $25,000 in the period's money to help the national cause. So that was the roots for what became the Arab National League. However, they had to put their activities on hold because a revolution, a big revolt erupted by the Druze of the Shuf Mountains, straddling Lebanon and Syria, against the French. The French were very, very heavy-handed, so the British, remember the French took Syria and Lebanon, the British took Palestine and Jordan. So there was a big rebellion, so get out basically. So the immigrants put off any work for the Palestine National League and began to collect funds. The Syrian Wounded Veterans Relief Committee was formed in Highland Park, Michigan, just north of Detroit. Headquarters were there. If you read Arabic, you can see, oh, here's in English also. In the Humber building. It says Detroit, but the exact location was Highland Park. And they were fairly organized. And this is a thank you letter by Sultan al-Atrash, the leader of that revolt, to Amin Farah, my guy, who owns those documents for his efforts. This receipt is very, very instructive, very, very important, and probably can support an entire paper. That signature belongs to Mohammed Amin Husseini. Al-Husseini, if you've heard of Yasser Arafat, he was the earlier version of Yasser Arafat. He's the leader of the Palestinians, spiritual and political leader rolled into one. Hajj Husseini was well respected. Because you could not send money to Syria immediately, the Arab Americans or Arab immigrants, increasingly thinking of themselves as Americans, but we'll have to talk about this a little bit more carefully, sent the money to Hajj al-Husseini, who then sent the money to al-Atrash, the leader of the revolt. That's a really important footnote, because they were being looked at as distinct in Syria, Palestine. They still thought of themselves as part of the same space. Until now, you had, for example, a daily newspaper in Palestine called Southern Syria. Yes, this is Palestine, we're Palestinians, but we're also Syrians. So they thought of themselves as Arab, Syrian, and then Palestinian, Damascene, what have you. So Arab subsumed all those identities. And that benevolent, the Aid Society became a formal, full-fledged political organization called the New Syria Party, headquartered in the same place in Highland Park. And it had chapters across the entire country. In Hannibal, Montana, and Minnesota, New York, of course, a big chapter, several actually, in Florida and elsewhere. So that was one of the first serious efforts to build on the Free Syria Society, anti-Ottoman, and worried about colonialism. This one was anti-French, and of course, by default, anti-British. So Palestine had to wait until that fight took its course. Of course, the French are far more powerful than these guys. There was a famous battle called May Saloon. They killed most of the Syrian rebels and ended them basically by end of 1927. But they did put up a good fight, the Syrians at the time. Before that happened, Al-Atrash sent emissaries comprised of Shakib Arsalan, a Druze prince, and Nassim Saiba, a Palestinian, although it really made no difference, Palestinian and Syrian. Those two represented Syria in the League of Nations, precursor to the UN, United Nations. So they came to Detroit. This is in a swanky hotel called the Book Cadillac Hotel, which was renovated. Now it's the Westin Hotel of Woodward.
Yeah.
There's another picture between the two. They toured the U.S. And one account says that they sent, in today's money, $2.5 million to the rebels. I don't know if they sent that much money. If they did, much of it would have come from Syrian immigrants in South America, in the Yucatan Peninsula. They were very wealthy, very well established there. In Brazil, as you know, which has more Lebanese than there are in Lebanon. In 1936, it was the Palestinians' turn to rebel against the British. It was uneven development. The peasants were pushed off their land. They could not find work because electrification, the harbor, all the capital that poured into Palestine was Jewish capital, and no Arab state applied. It was that simple. Things became dire until they had an 11-month strike and rebelled. The leader of the revolt was Azzeddin Qassam. Wonder if that sounds familiar. And of course, eventually that rebellion too was put down very, very violently by the British. They killed and wounded 15,000 people, killed Azzeddin Qassam and all his friends as well. But what happened on this side of the waters is that the Arab National League was founded, the Jamia al-Arabiyya, nothing to do with the League of Arab States, by the way. And it became far more sophisticated than the New Syria Party. They wrote their bylaws in English and in Arabic. They appealed to both. Their application for membership was in English and in Arabic. Correspondence, they lobbied Congress, they sent letters, and they had chapters across the country. The Detroit News reported that they had 15,000 members. Hajj Amin Husseini sent 2 emissaries. Jamil Bayham, the leader of the consortium of anti-Zionist organizations in Lebanon, in Beirut, and Emil al-Ghori, a Christian, not that it made any difference. And those 2 gentlemen were well respected and represented all of Syria again, even this late in history. Came to Detroit twice, 1938, 1939, and attended conferences. And then the 4th conference in 1939, in September, something happened. Namely, an articulation of very specific Arab American identity was uttered. I could not find anything that comes close anywhere else in my readings. They felt that they belonged here. You know, structural integration is unavoidable. 35, 40 years ago, I could hardly sound like this. Spoke with broken English. Look at me now. I have like 2 corn-fed children and all of that. So a measure of assimilation, although I don't like the word, but integration is inevitable. And they already were here for 3 or 4 generations since the late 19th century, right? So they gathered in Flint, Michigan. This is the keynote speaker, Eliyahu Grant, an archaeologist, pro-Palestinian. And one of the guests, one of the speakers said, we're not merely Arabs in America, we are Arab Americans. But what happened, what really hastened this articulation is that 2 things. First, cultural pluralist models began to replace that paradigm called melting pot, or mutating into something to fit an Anglo core, until that was challenged, not until the 1960s by Nathan Glazer. If you're a sociologist, Anglo core did not exist anymore by then. But at that time, you had to conform. But the United States was beginning to open up onto the world, hence South Pacific, for example, especially after World War II. And cultural pluralist model had its day in the sun, so to speak. But something else happened. World War II started in Europe when Germany plowed into Poland. And everyone knew the United States will join the fight. And it's going to be a serious one. It was building up. They knew about Nazism, they knew about their menace, and they knew they would be joining the fight. So they suspended the operations of the Arab National League and joined the army, many of them. Per capita, Arab Americans raised more money for World War I, World War II than any other immigrant group. So they really wanted to belong. but they still cared about the fate of their country. And now it's becoming more and more about Palestine, because you have Lebanon, you have Syria. By 1946, they became independent. Transjordan, created by the British. The Palestinians felt they were left out. If you ask a Zionist what they think of all of this, they'll tell you, and they have, and they use this very, very often, is that Palestine never existed. Yeah, because the French and the British didn't want it to exist. It doesn't mean there are no Palestinians, right? And east of the Jordan River was a very artificial thing. I mean, I hate to break it down to Jordanians, but if you've heard of mensa, which is a very, very Jordanian dish, that actually came from Nablus. One can go down the list. The connectedness between Jordanians and Palestinians is inextricable. Yes, many came from Western Saudi Arabia at some point, but trade and cultural activities were centered more in Palestine, spilled into Jordan. And to say that, this is part of Jordan now was arbitrary and didn't make any sense. On the shore, Haifa and Jaffa and Akka and the Galilee and Gaza, those were very vibrant, very sophisticated commercial and cultural life was happening there. Walid Khalidi wrote a book called Before Their Diaspora that can shed light on that. This is a thank you letter by Hajj Amin Husseini to Amin Farah by name. And of course, Arab Americans began to be woven into American culture. This is the first ace in U.S. aviation history. You know what an ace is, right? A pilot that can down several planes. And there are many, many examples like this. Sorry if I'm annoying you. I have to whiz through this so we can have a conversation. There's 2 ambulances, Arab American Flintites, donated to the war effort. And when they came back from the war, they founded what is called the Institute of Arab American Affairs. And those guys were full-fledged Americans, Arab Americans. They wanted to represent U.S. interests in the Middle East in a way that benefits both. They wanted to balance Zionism as much as they can. Of course, by then, in 1942, the Biltmore Zionist Conference took place, and Zionists, very, very powerful Zionists worldwide, decided that a political aim would be the establishment of a state in Palestine. And of course, they could bring a lot of pressure to bear. They still can, by the way. And the Institute of Arab American Affairs lasted from 1944 until 1951, until it ran out of steam. People were afraid to support them, interact with them. They were headquartered in New York. To give you an idea, members in the World Zionist Organization's New York chapter alone were about over 100,000 Arab Americans in the entire United States. I mean, Palestinians could number a few thousand at best. So there was no contest. I mean, millions of Jewish immigrants came from Poland and Russia, settled in New York. Many of them, not all, of course, became attracted to the Zionist cause for one reason or another, especially after the news of the Holocaust began to spread. So those were targeted by hardcore, the Jabotinsky type Zionists who saw the whole thing as a zero-sum game. It's either us or them, no coexistence, none. And that's what's behind Netanyahu's pronouncements about total war. And of course, the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League of B'nai B'rith, did what it always does, frankly, spied on the Institute of Arab American Affairs, published in their internal records how suspicious they are of those Arabs. Although Fuad Shatara, he's gone by now, he committed suicide in 1941 because of the harassment he faced in New York. He was a good acquaintance of Albert Einstein, because Albert Einstein reached out to him due to his opposition, Einstein's that is, to the Zionist program as a political program. He was a spiritual Zionist, but did not believe in the necessity of creating a state per se. The British actually were more committed to that aim than Einstein was, until it became almost irreversible Al-Nakba, 1948, hastened the demise of the Institute of Arab-American Affairs. Support for the Zionist program began to spread and became almost impossible to overcome. So there were immigration restrictions, by the way, between 1924 and 1965, quota system that allowed very few people to come to the United States. 1% ultimately of any people already in the United States can enter, which is a couple of hundred at best. So Arab American life began severed between the early immigrants who came before that date, before 1924, 1930 or so. Very few trickled in after World War II. But the bulk of Arab Americans, as you know them, came after 1965, the Hart-Celler Act, when immigration restrictions were removed. And people began to immigrate from all parts of the world. And many came actually on student visas, family reunification. So we're severed in two waves. And that's the reason why all these records went over the heads of most of the founders of Arab American Studies, whose work I value and I teach. But that's why I found myself challenging a lot of assumptions that Arab Americans never cared about politics, were apolitical, did not care about the fate of their countries overseas. They were just basically concerned about village and clan and family ties more than anything else, like primary group affiliations, which is not true at all. And they began to organize. Organization of Arab Students was among the first in Detroit at Wayne State University. So I talked to as many people as I can for a new book to build on. My book concluded in 1951, so I'm covering what Rashid Khalidi calls the lost years after that date until 1967. Very, very tough, but I think I'm there as a conceptual framework about what happened. Those guys hit the ground running and founded, as a result of the 1967 Naksa, or dejection, or the other disaster befell the Palestinians when the rest of Palestine was overrun by Zionists. They founded the Association of Arab American University Graduates. And those guys could not publish anywhere to save their lives because they explained the Arab point of view of the conflict. So they established the Medina Press, and in the process established Arab American Studies. Michael Suleiman, Edward Said was among them, Ibrahim Abulod, and Barbara Aswad, and Janice Terry. I spoke to all of them. Barbara is no longer with us, but Janice Terry is. And also I'm writing a chapter on the GUPS, or the General Union for Palestine Students. I don't want to venture here with that because it's work in progress. I think it originated in Cairo, was transplanted here in the United States as early as 1965, by the way. So, and you have the new organization like the American Arab Anti-Discrimination Committee, very fun organization. The reason why I want to mention it quickly is that that's where young people could go. I went almost every year to their conferences in the 1980s and early 90s, and found myself basically hanging out with Edward Said, Khamis Maksoud, the ambassador, the Arab states ambassador to the UN, potent orator and hugely important person. Noam Chomsky. I became sort of friends with Alfred Lilienthal, if you remember the name. I got to know Isaiah Shahak really well. That's what's missing in Arab American life now, that contiguity, the mentor-mentee relationship. It seems to me, unless the students here can correct me on that one. And Arab Americans suffered what I call the 1-2 punch. The one was the first Gulf War. The two was the peace process, Oslo in 1993. Disaster took the urgency away from us, and the punch was 9/11. So a lot has happened And what also happened, and I'm writing about this, is that the founders of Arab American Studies, the natural mentors we once had, Saeed, Abu Lughal, and others, are no longer with us. Thank God for Chomsky and Norm Finkelstein and Ilan Pappé. Hopefully we'll have both in Michigan again in November and also in January, respectively. We still have them, and they're still repeating what they've told us about what's happening in Gaza and in Palestine. And this is a timeline of what happened in Gaza, just so we're clear on the context for October 7th. It didn't come out of the blue. It was not wanton violence by Hamas against civilians. It was a military operation. Parts of it were brutal, yes. Festival attendees were killed, where they were not bearing arms at the time. You cannot condone that. But all of those are enlistees in the IDF, by the way. And the sheer volume of suffering in Gaza for as long as it lasted, 17 years or so, convinced those guys to be brutal. The question is, were they cruel? Did they rape? Did they cut off heads of children? Not a shred of evidence suggests that they did. Rapes are part of war. Israelis rape Palestinian women all the time in prisons. The United Nations said they are doing it recently. Did that happen to Israeli women? It may have. We need evidence of that. The article in the New York Times was refuted, and the author of that article, it turned out, is an Israeli intelligence officer who conveniently got a job as a reporter, and he came up with that lie. There were no babies who were burned, no babies lost their heads by Hamas fighters. But think about it. The president of this country came on live television and said, cutting off heads of babies and raping women and this and that, and Blinken repeated that, was actually intended for one thing only: wage war by the United States, the preeminent power on the planet, on the Palestinians. Immediately he sent an aircraft carrier with all its war machinery, enough to invade an entire continent, to the Middle East to send a signal. That was the signal for the Israelis to kill as many as they can. The first 2 weeks of bombing of Gaza caused the lives of more than the carpet bombing of Dresden or Baden-Baden did, or even Tokyo, by conventional weapons. Eventually more people died there. But in the first 2 weeks, the carnage, there's no actually equivalent to that unless you go back to the Mongol invasion or the First Crusade, killing anywhere between 60 and 100,000 people in Jerusalem alone by machetes and swords on industrial scale over 3 weeks, 4 weeks. It was documented meticulously by historians. So that shocked the East, and the carnage in Gaza shocked the entire world. And the reasons for it should not be a surprise, you guys. It's been in motion since the age of explorations and finding all those cash crops and ways to wreak havoc around the world. I'll stop here, and hopefully we can have a conversation about what next, or how do you, especially students, conceive of advocacy right now? What is it lacking? Where could it go? Is that history? Does it matter in Arab American life? Does mentorship, does contiguity matter to you or not? I work with students all the time. I can't figure them out. No surprise. And that's your prerogative, of course. I was one of you at one point. But I always had a mentor. Is mentorship important to you? Is understanding the events of the past, how they shape the present, matter? Do you think of that as a way to chart the future? Thank you, Anders. I'm very grateful for this invitation. The Socialist students, Keweenaw Socialists. I've had a wonderful visit so far. Thank you for your hospitality.